Eric Lanigan with Lanigan & Lanigan Attorneys in Winter Park, Florida. We often take certain things about real estate transactions for granted, yet I often forget when a foreign investor comes in, the whole thing is foreign to them in terms of how things work. So I'm going to take a couple minutes just to go over a couple of things to take into consideration if you're considering purchasing real estate in Florida and you're from overseas or you're not familiar with how transactions work in our area. We often refer to the point where you complete the purchase as the closing, and I'm going to use that phrase a little bit as I talk forward. Sometimes it'll be referred to as the settlement. Either way, what we're talking about is that point in time where the buyer and the seller, the realtor, the lawyer, everyone comes together, all the papers are signed, money changes hands, and the title to the property changes. Now, in Florida, there are certain closing costs that you need to take into consideration. One benefit we have in Florida is there's no sales tax on real estate transactions in Florida. In other words, no percentage of the selling price gets paid in taxes. But there can be significant costs. For example, if you have a mortgage, you have documentary stamps on the mortgage, and those are $3.50 a thousand. It doesn't sound like much, but if you're buying $1 million property, it starts to all add up. You also have intangible tax on the mortgage, which is $2 a thousand. Now, if it's a cash deal, you don't have either the documentary stamps or the intangible tax on the mortgage. But there are other closing costs. There's a real estate commission, property inspection fees, unpaid taxes, which may or may not be a buyer's cost in a transaction. One thing you want to make sure that you always do is get a good faith estimate of what your closing costs will be before you sign the contract. Review it and all the pre-closing steps with your attorney, because there can be a great deal of negotiation in terms of how the costs are divided between buyer and seller. And you want to make sure that you're getting at least a fair shake on how those things are divided. And oftentimes, if somebody's really anxious to get rid of a property, you can push a lot of those closing costs onto the seller, and they'll accept it just to get the sale done. There's no tax per se on the property when a foreign national purchases the property. It's treated just like any other purchaser. If it's rental property, all rental income is subject to U.S. income taxes. Many countries, most countries probably, have some form of double taxation treaty with the U.S. to prevent you from paying double taxes both in the United States and in your home country. And generally speaking, on rental properties in Florida, there tends to be very little taxes paid because there are very generous deductions for depreciation, mortgage interest, and the full cost of 2 trips from wherever you live to Florida to inspect and review your property each year. So when you take those things and you subtract them out off of rental income, at least on paper, you appear to be breaking even at best on the property. Now, when you get to the sale of the property, now you get into the Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act, which goes back to, I think, 1980, 1990, which requires that 10% of the selling price be withheld if the seller is a foreign national. Interestingly, the responsibility falls on the buyer to make sure that that happens, not on the foreign national seller. If the buyer doesn't make sure that those funds are withheld, then it is the buyer who the IRS is going to come and seek to collect that tax from. So it's a tax that should be withheld if you're the seller, but ultimately it's the buyer's responsibility to make sure that it happens. And that's obviously based on the premise that if it's a foreign national selling the property, there's a high likelihood they're going to take their sales proceeds and go back to their country of origin, and that there, at that point, the ability of the U.S. to collect those taxes is slim and none. Now, there is no requirement to do that withholding if the property is selling for less than $300,000 and it's going to be the buyer's personal residence. There can be significant benefits from buying properties in what we call off-plan, which is pre-construction. And I'm going to do a separate video which talks about what are the benefits, what are the risks and rewards of looking into buying property off-plan if you're a foreign investor. Again, I'm Eric Lanigan, Lanigan & Lanigan Attorneys, Winter Park.